Hello and welcome again to the Lydia Magruder channel. I want to apologize briefly as a matter of housekeeping for the low volume on the presentation last time. I had accidentally bumped the volume knob on my microphone and I had not properly checked it. So I've tried to fix that this week, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me better this time and not have to turn the volume cranked way up. I also want to mention that later in the presentation today, there is going to be a new undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letter of 1 Corinthians. Why don't I do it at the beginning, you might ask? Well, because I'm a stickler for organization and the talk today has a certain flow and that comes up at a certain point. But I'm mentioning that at the outset to get you to keep watching the whole thing, and I think we have lots of good content for you today about the agreement between Acts and Paul's epistles, contrary to what Bart Ehrman says. Now, what does Bart Ehrman say that we're going to address today? Well, as you know from watching my previous videos, maybe watching some videos on Testify, or just reading Ehrman's work or listening to his presentations, he thinks there are a number of contradictions between Acts and Paul's letters, and he uses this to try to undermine the reliability of Acts and to say that the author could not have been a companion of Paul. One of these that he emphasizes a lot concerns Paul's agreement with the other apostles and whether he got along with them well and so forth. This is an old objection, which doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it has been answered on more than one occasion. Ehrman's strong statement that he makes, for example, in his book Forged, is that Acts portrays Paul as completely agreeing with specifically Peter and James, who are leading apostles, on every matter of doctrinal and practical significance. I mean, he actually says that. Now, I mean, since Acts is a narrative, it's a little hard to see how it could actually assert or even imply that Paul, it's such a strong statement that Paul agreed with them on every matter of doctrinal or practical significance. In particular, Ehrman emphasizes the issues concerning the Gentiles. And he emphasizes that in Acts, which is true, fairly early in Acts, Peter is actually the first person to take the gospel to the Gentiles, to the centurion Cornelius, even before Paul, known as later as the apostle to the Gentiles, comes along. And at that time, Peter stays with Cornelius for a while and eats with him, and he even gets criticized for this when he returns to the rest of the leaders of the early church. But he stands up and says, well, you know, they received the gospel. I was sent to them by a vision, and then they received the gospel and just like we did, and they received the Holy Ghost just like we did because they began to speak in tongues. So this is a sign that this was really from God, and I was not wrong to do that. Then in Acts 15, there has been this controversy over whether the Gentiles need to be circumcised and keep the whole law. And the disciples gathered together, including James and Peter, and they have what is often known as the Jerusalem Council. And in that, both James and Peter speak up and say, no, the Gentiles shouldn't have to be circumcised and keep the whole law of Moses. Here are our decrees about what we think the Gentiles really need to do, and I'll be getting into the details of those later. But this does show them as in agreement with Paul about certain issues concerning the Gentiles and whether they needed to be circumcised, which of course is something Paul emphasizes in Galatians, that they do not need to be circumcised. But then Ehrman emphasizes on the other side, in Galatians 2, Paul has a conflict with Peter over the issue of eating with Gentiles. And Ehrman says Peter is not treated in a friendly way in this. And that's kind of an interesting way to put it. It certainly shows that there was a time when Peter and Paul didn't agree over eating with Gentiles, and Paul says, I withstood him to his face. I told him off because he was in the wrong. So Ehrman emphasizes these different emphases, and he makes a contradiction out of them concerning, as he puts it, all matters of practical or theological significance that supposedly they agree in Acts, but they disagree in Galatians. Now, to begin with, this is showing Bart's favorite argument. It's so common that I really think it would be fair to call it his favorite argument, which is the argument from silence. Because what he's really doing is he's pointing out an emphasis difference that arises from the fact that Galatians doesn't tell about those earlier events when Peter took the gospel to some Gentiles and even ate with them that occur earlier in Acts, and then Acts doesn't tell about this particular controversy with Peter. Okay, so, yippee, it doesn't tell about, one doesn't tell about one set of things, the other doesn't tell about the other set of things. This doesn't make a contradiction. The other thing is that Ehrman is using cherry-picked data. And that's going to be the emphasis of the whole rest of my discussion here, that there is other data that Ehrman just ignoring, other items of information that actually show strong agreement. Some of these are more obvious than others. Some of them are subtler than others. So one of the most obvious that Ehrman just doesn't mention is that in Galatians it specifically says that in Antioch, where this controversy occurred with Peter, he was at first eating with the Gentiles. And it was only after certain people came from James, and it's not clear what they said to him, but then he began thinking he shouldn't eat with the Gentiles, so that this was a change on the part of Peter. Now that actually fits pretty well with Acts, because it's saying that there was a time when Peter did eat with Gentiles, and he only changed later. Another piece of data is that in Galatians, Paul emphasizes the fact that when there was a controversy about circumcision, that the leaders stood with him, and that he had Gentile associates who were not required to be circumcised. So that actually fits again with the Jerusalem Council, that he can actually call to witness an agreement with the apostles and the other apostles and himself over whether Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised. So he emphasizes that in Galatians, even though he doesn't tell all of the times explicitly what Peter said, or the earlier time when Peter went to Cornelius. So Bart is cherry picking. He's also overlooking the fact that the very controversy over Gentile circumcision itself is a point of agreement. If the author of Acts, I'm going to call him Luke, I believe he was Luke, I've argued he was Luke, but it just gets tedious to keep saying the author of Acts over and over again. If Luke was just trying to make everything look rosy and like everybody just agreed about everything, he didn't need to report on that controversy at all. And he didn't need to talk about the Jerusalem Council and how that was resolved, or at least temporarily resolved. As we'll see, that didn't resolve everything. So there are issues that are visible in both places, and the very fact that these were issues plaguing the church, the early church at the time, is a point of agreement. Whether Gentiles, Christians had to be circumcised is one of them, but also meat offered to idols. In the agreement that the church comes to in Acts 15, they specifically say, okay, but the Gentiles have to refrain from meat offered to idols. As you know, if you've read 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking quite a bit about meat offered to idols there, and it's clear that it's an issue, it's a controversy, and it's a controversy that would especially be present where you had Gentile believers and Jewish believers in the same church. And I think that's evidence that the church at Corinth did have both, though that's another thing Bart denies. He tries to say that the church at Corinth was all and only Gentiles. I don't think 1 Corinthians looks like that at all. So the existence of the same controversies is something that Ehrman's overlooking in his cherry picking. Now, there are more subtle agreements, and these are very interesting. When you look at Acts 15 and what they come to, what do? They say, okay, the Gentile believers don't have to get circumcised, the men don't have to, but we declare that they have to refrain from eating meat offered to idols, they have to refrain from things that have been strangled, and that they have to refrain from blood. And so, like, for example, kosher slaughter is meant to drain as much meat as possible out of the animal, and if you strangle the animal rather than killing it by, cutting off its head or cutting its throat or whatever, you're going to get more blood left in the meat. So they put these things in there, and to my eye, it looks like an administrative compromise. And something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I will emphasize more as I go on, is the realism of Acts in this respect, and the realistic picture that emerges from both Acts and 1 Corinthians. This is a fluid time period in the church, and they're working out these practical matters, and it's difficult for them to work everything out just in one letter, like what the apostles write and the council writes in Acts 15. So it looks like they're trying to kind of put in something for both. No, the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, but yes, there are these dietary things. And they also mention fornication, which is obviously a moral issue, and they put that all in the same letter. But dietary matters like not eating things offered to idols or things that have been strangled. Not only does this show a fluid situation, but it's a tricky situation where they're not going to be able to address everything. And I would say in some ways it's an inherently unstable compromise. And you kind of begin to realize this when you ponder the fact that eating with Gentiles was a problem even earlier in Acts. And, some Jews of the time believed that even to go into a Gentile's house was to be ceremonially unclean, that the dwellings of Gentiles were ceremonially unclean. Well, you can see why in a church that had both Jews and Gentiles, and they're eating from house to house, having the meal that surrounded the Eucharist. Are they going to say, oh, no, we can't eat in the Gentiles' house? It's a little bit like during COVID. Oh, boy, I'm not sure we're going to have a potluck at those people's house because, they don't wear masks or something like that. That it could create all kinds of practical problems. How much do you hang out with Gentiles? Now, this is a subtle agreement because in Galatians, what's the controversy? It's that Peter is spending time even eating with Gentiles at first, and then some people come from Jerusalem, from James, and they give him a hard time, and he's like, oops, I better not. Does that mean he didn't think he should go into a Gentile house? Does that mean he didn't think he should eat a meal at a Gentile house? This comes up even in modern Orthodox Judaism. It's fine usually for a Gentile to eat in the home of a Jew, but for a strongly Orthodox Jew to eat at the home of a Gentile creates problems because the kitchen is not kept kosher. And for example, the spoons that are used for dairy are not going to be kept separate from the spoons that are used for beef, and there are dietary restrictions that are rabbinically interpreted that you've got to keep everything separate. Some modern Orthodox Jews literally have separate dishwashers for these different things. When my husband taught at a yeshiva many years ago, I was young and enthusiastic, and I said, hey, can I make chocolate chip cookies for your students, for your yeshiva students? And he asked, what would it take for chocolate chip cookies to be kosher? Because my wife would like to make chocolate chip cookies for you guys, for the boys. And the boys said, well, it has to be made in a kosher kitchen. Well, I didn't have a kosher kitchen, right? So there were all kinds of these practical issues. We find in Acts that Paul spends so much time with Gentiles in Jerusalem when he comes to Jerusalem that that's part of what is used against him in the riot that they start, because the Asian Jews start a rumor that he brought a Gentile into the temple courts, and a portion of the temple courts where Gentiles weren't allowed. And the author, Luke, says that's because they had seen him in the city spending so much time with Trophimus that they thought he'd brought Trophimus into the temple. And they started a big riot over that. I think Luke himself was a Gentile and was with him at that time. It might have also been because they saw him spending time with Luke. So Paul's emphasis is that we should be one in Christ. We should be spending all this time with Gentiles and not making all these separations. And you can see where it would raise these practical questions. That's a subtle agreement between Acts and Galatians. Intermarriage is another issue that is not addressed. If we're all one in Christ, as Paul says in Galatians 3:28, should Jewish Christians be intermarrying with Gentile Christians? This issue is never addressed either in Acts or in any of Paul's epistles. I have my own ideas about what Paul would have said if you'd asked him, and I think maybe some of the Jewish hardliners had their own ideas about that as well. So again, the fact that this is such a fluid situation and that there were practical issues that were going to come up is an agreement between both of them. Now, I haven't even gotten to the new undesigned coincidence. We're going to get there in a few minutes. Keep listening. I want to read a passage right now in Acts 21, 18 through 25, and I just want you to sort of hear this passage. Paul has come to Jerusalem after his journeys through Asia Minor. This is the last, and through Greece, which we talked about in an earlier broadcast. This is the last time he's in Jerusalem before his first Roman imprisonment. All right. And now the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. And after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." Notice how, they glorify God, but they move pretty quickly. They're worried about something. "And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses in order that they may shave their heads. And all will note that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication." Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple. Okay, I read a little of verse 26. Now, there's just so many striking things about this passage that I just really want you to notice. First of all, it comes as a jolt. If you've been reading Acts up until now, you know that Jews who are zealous for the law have been Paul's arch enemies up to this point. In Asia, they've been pursuing him from town to town. They've been causing trouble for him. And now suddenly we come here and we find James and the other elders going, "Paul, there are all these fellow brethren in Christ who are really zealous for the law. Please do something to appease them. Okay, they don't seem to judge these hardliners. They don't seem to they don't seem to think that their zealousness and their being angry at Paul over the rumors they have heard are any sort of problem for them. The problem is Paul. In fact, they almost sound afraid. What are we going to do? They're going to hear that you've come. It's like, you can imagine Paul going, kind of rolling his eyes. He does what they ask of him. But this idea that we need to sort of cower before them and prove to them that these rumors are false and so forth, it's not Paul's mode of operation generally. He does what they ask him to do, but we definitely do not get the feeling of Paul agreeing with even James about every matter of practical importance here. That's not the feeling you get here. Notice, too, that when they say what they've written to them, they emphasize the prohibitions that they've written. They don't emphasize, but the Gentiles don't need to keep the law of Moses. I mean, they don't contradict that. But they emphasize, now we told them to abstain from meat offered to idols and from blood and from things strangled. So it's, it's all okay. These hardliners shouldn't be upset, but they've heard this rumor about you. It almost is like they seem not to wish that Paul had come. Now, we know he was bringing money for the church at Jerusalem. We talked about that in an earlier presentation, and there's a hint of it later in Acts as well. But they're like, oh, when you were gone, we didn't have to deal with this problem. But now they're going to hear that you've come, and they're going to be really upset. Now, one of the greatest things is that this rumor about Paul is something that there is some excuse for in Paul's epistles. So now we're finally going to get to the new undesigned coincidence that I found while I was reading and preparing for this presentation. I've never heard anybody else do this. This is very cool. 1 Corinthians 9, 20 to 21. Paul writing, "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews, to those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law." Now, if you were a hardliner, you were let's say someone who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but really thought it was important that Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah keep all of the laws, the Mosaic laws, and circumcise their children, not intermarry with Gentiles, keep completely kosher, keep the Sabbath, and be, strictly observant Jews. What would you think if you heard that verse? Maybe you heard it read, or you heard a rumor about what it contained, those two verses. Paul says that he himself is not really under the law, and that he becomes to the Jews as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Now, Paul himself is a Jew, but he says he's just keeping the laws of Moses. Now, obviously, I don't think, I know he's not referring to fornication, which he forbids everywhere else, okay? But he's making, I think, tacitly the distinction between ceremonial and moral law here, which many theologians have made. And he's saying that when it comes to the pure ceremonial things, he's not actually bound by those. He's not really under the law. That's certainly what it sounds like he's saying. But he does it to win the Jews. And that when he's dealing with those who are themselves not under the law, he becomes as one who is not under the law, but only under the law of Christ, but not under the law of Moses. Can you imagine how that is going to strike some of those people described that we just read about in Acts 21, those who believe but are very zealous for the law? yeah, that could give rise to a rumor that Paul himself does not walk orderly, keeping all the laws of Moses, and that Paul teaches that those who are Jews don't actually have to keep all these rules. You could definitely read those verses that way. And there are other things in Paul's epistles that could be read that way. I would say in certain ways he fudges on not eating meat offered to idols. He treats that question in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. And what he says is that it's a kind of what we might call a don't ask, don't tell policy. If you buy meat out in the marketplace and it's not kind of labeled, hey, this has been offered to idols, you can just buy it and don't worry about it. Or if you're invited to someone's home and they just put food in front of you, they put meat in front of you, it's okay to eat that. You don't have to say, now I need to make inquiry, has this been offered to idols or not? You don't need to do that. But if the person says, hey, this is meat offered to idols, and kind of winks at, this reminds me of the way that some people treat alcohol. They're like, hey, aren't we cool? We're getting away with it. We're drinking alcohol. I'm going to, corrupt this young Baptist who's been raised that it's wrong to drink. Hey, want some wine, dude? You don't need to keep these laws. If there's that kind of gloating over breaking that rule, then don't do it. Because then you're participating in a kind of pushing the envelope. Okay, and he admits that those who have who consciously eat meat offered to idols deliberately as a participation in the sacrifice, they're doing something wrong. They think of themselves as participating in the sacrifice to idols, and you don't want to be doing that. But if it's just served, you don't need to make inquiry. Now, none of that was said at the Jerusalem Council. None of those practical nitpicks were addressed, and you can definitely see where someone who was like, hey, we told the Gentiles that Gentile Christians are not supposed to eat meat offered to idols, and now here's Paul telling them that it's not intrinsically wrong to do, and that the important thing is that they not harm their weaker brother's conscience, and that they shouldn't ask questions, and they can eat it if it's been offered to idols. They don't have to inquire into that. Come on. What else is he teaching? We know how these things work, where you see a certain trend line in something that a person is teaching. We have things like this that happen nowadays in the church, where you're like, where's this guy going? Where is all this going? This guy sounds like a compromiser. Sometimes, often we're right, and often he's compromising on something he shouldn't compromise on, and I'm not going to get into a digression about who that might be, or ethical matters, where I'm actually on the side of those who would seem to be hardliners, and other people are saying, hey, do not judge, and so forth, and we're like, he needs to make it clear where he stands, and sometimes that's right to do. I'm saying, though, that sociologically we are familiar with situations where one group of people is saying, hey, we see a certain trend in this guy's teaching, and he needs to make it clear where he stands, which is exactly what Acts 21, 18 through 26 records. And it just happens to be on certain matters that maybe, are not intrinsically moral matters, but that's what happens. So whatever conclusions we draw about where Paul was going, or what he would have said about subjects he didn't address, we can well imagine how the teaching in his letters that he had already written by that time could have given rise to that rumor, and to such an extent that I would even call the connection between 1 Corinthians 9, 20 through 21, and that passage in Acts 21 an undesigned coincidence, because Paul says that he himself, being an apostle, is not really under the law of Moses, even though, of course, everyone knows he himself is a Jew. What I'm asking you to do here, then, is to use your human knowledge of human affairs and your common sense, and to widen your evidential focus. Very often, when such contradictions of emphasis are alleged by someone like Bart Ehrman, or even concerning the gospel, sometimes even by Christian scholars. So, for example, some will say that there are more conflicts with Pharisees and Phariseeism in John than there are in the earlier Gospels, or more in Matthew than in Luke or Mark or something like that. But when you widen your focus and you actually don't cherry pick and you take all of the evidence into account, it turns out that's not true. And that's a tool that I really want to recommend to you here. So be sure to like and subscribe, recommend this channel to other people, because we're giving you tools that you may not find anywhere else, and even new undesigned coincidences that I'm quite sure you've never heard anywhere else. Thanks for watching.